everyone, my name is Reggie and welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new. Today's video is going to be my July wrap-up, so this means in this video I will be talking about all of the books I read in the month of July. There were 13 of them. I do have 14 books to talk about today, and if you've read the title, you know why. That's because I DNF'd a book this month, and I fully support and believe in DNFing books, but I don't find that it's something I myself do very often. I DNF'd Night Film by Marisha Pessl, which is horrifying because this is a book I've been wanting to read for years and years and years. This book follows a disgraced journalist named Scott. He was disgraced because he said some pretty rough things against this guy named Cordova, who has a cult following. Produces, writes, creates these underground, dark, horror, gruesome type films. And in the course of this book, that man's daughter commit suicide. However, Scott, our disgraced journalist and protagonist of this book, doesn't think that's what it is, and he starts investigating and seeing what happened. I think it can really come down to this book was boring. You'll find that's something I often use to describe books that I don't like, and I kind of hate that about myself. I wish I could find a better way to describe things. However, there is no other word for me to describe this book because this is the most bored I've ever been while reading. I didn't want to pick up this book. I didn't want to pick up other books. This was going to put me in a slip if I didn't DNF it. I tried reading the physical book, which has multimedia elements in it, if you can see them. See, has some things going on for it. So I thought the physical route was the way to go. Tried a physical book, tried an electronic copy on my phone, tried the ebook on my iPad mini. I tried listening to the audiobook. I could not get through this book. I got to 44%, and at that point I was listening to it, and it was an audiobook, and it's a 26-hour audiobook, and I was sitting there looking at I have 15 hours left of this audiobook. Even listening it at 2 times speed, it will take me almost 8 hours to get through the rest of this book. And I just couldn't do that to myself. I was so bored. I was so uninterested. So I DNF'd this. I will be unhauling it. I'm sorry, I just couldn't. So the next book I have to talk about is We Are Here Forever by Michelle Gish. This is a comic bind-up. This is a web series comic, but I believe these comics were never published online. This story follows these cute purple creatures called Paramus. They're supposedly nicer, they're definitely innocent little creatures that have taken over Earth after humans have, who knows? Humans aren't on Earth anymore though. There aren't really living creatures on Earth. There's plants, but it doesn't seem like there's humans, animals, anything like that. So these are the only living inhabitants of this planet. And they're super cute and innocent and sweet. And there were some moments where it's oh, this is pure and sweet and cute and stuff like that. However, how this, I believe, was pitched to me was as a sustainability story about Earth. And I don't know where I got that from, but that's not what this is. Also, I just assumed, and that's 100% on me, but I assumed this book was a narrative moving forward, and that's definitely not the case. These comics pretty much stand alone. They don't have a running theme or narrative moving forward. We don't ever really find out what happens to the humans. There are hints, I guess, about what happened, but I honestly don't care what happened to the humans because there's no narrative thread. So there's no point. The story isn't moving forward. And that's just not really my kind of thing. It was not for me. And that's disappointing because this was sent to me by Quirk Books, and I do so much appreciate Quirk Books sending this to me, but I just didn't love it. The art style is beautiful. I think there's an audience for this. I think people will love this. Obviously, there's an audience for this because this is an existing webcomic that was popular enough to get a book published. So there's that. But I'm just not that intended audience. I just kind of got annoyed with this, and it felt very long for a short graphic novel comic bind-up, so I gave it a 2 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read Tithe by Holly Black. This is the first book in the modern fairy trilogy. I think that's what it's called. So I don't like fairy books, or at least I thought I didn't like fairy books, until I read a fairy or fae short story that Samantha Shannon wrote, who's my favorite author, Marigold, and she wrote that in the 13 Tales of Villainy booktuber compilation, Because You Love to Hate Me short story thing. She wrote it in that, and I loved it. I fell head over heels in love with it, and I was like, okay, maybe fays might be not just Sarah J. Maas fays. Maybe I'll actually like fays if I give them a true and honest chance. And Holly Black seems to be that true and honest chance. Because a lot of her fae stories are so beloved, and she is super into fae, so if anyone in the YA world is going to do them right, it's probably her. So I decided to start with this because a lot of girls, including Jane Lindsay, who's one of my favorite booktubers, are doing a read-along for this series. So I decided to jump on the bandwagon, and I had pretty mixed feelings about this. Overall, I thought the plot was really boring. I didn't like the main character. It was really reminiscent of its time when it was published. However, I loved the fae world. I loved the fairies. I loved that dynamic of it. I just didn't like a lot of the things that happened in this story. So what that tells me is that while this book didn't stick with me, while I didn't really enjoy this book, Holly Black's fae world probably is the one for me once I keep going to it. I didn't enjoy this. I enjoyed elements of it so much. The fae world was so fascinating to me that I'm here for it. I'm gonna keep going, and I gave this a 2 out of 5 stars. Next up, we have Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close by Jonathan Safran Foer. This is a book that I've been meaning to read for quite a few years. This is a book that sounds fascinating and was also my first Jonathan Safran Foer, who is an author that I previously had a lot of books on my TBR by. I say previously because I didn't like this, and I didn't like this enough that I don't think I'm going to read anything else by him now. This is the only book I own from him, so it's not a great loss on my wallet or anything like that, but I was let down. I ended up giving this a 2.5 out of 5 stars. So this follows a 9-year-old boy named Oscar whose father died in the 9/11 attacks. It's a bit later after that incident, and Oscar has found a key within his father's possessions and believes this is gonna unlock some mystery, give him more information. And so he goes on the scavenger hunt type thing through New York City trying to find the door or whatever that unlocks this key and trying to figure out the mystery of this key and what's going on with it. Didn't like Oscar's perspective. That was a big problem for me. He said some pretty sexist and racist things, especially towards the beginning of this book, which really kicked it off on a sour note for me. It got better as time went on. However, I just wasn't into that, and it's kind of concerning to me that that's stuff coming out of a 9-year-old's mouth. I hope 9-year-olds aren't really like that. I don't know a lot of kids, but I hope 9-year-olds aren't acting like that. But that's part of what made me think like Jonathan Safran Foer probably just isn't for me. However, there is a side plot in this, and it's told kind of in letters in the past, and I love that perspective. I'm not going to tell you how it ties into the greater story because I think that's something that you figure out as it's going on, and that's really was maybe the most enjoyable part of the story for me. I really love those side letters and trying to figure out how they pieced into this narrative with 9-year-old Oscar. And I mean, you pick up on it pretty quickly if you're paying attention. However, I love that side part. That was so much fun. I was so invested in that. And if that would have been the entire book, this would have been a 5 out of 5 stars. That's how much I loved those sections. However, overall, I just didn't like this. I didn't like the ending. I don't want to say that the ending was predictable, but in the end, it went where I expected it to go. If you've read My Grandmother Asked Me to Tell You She's Sorry by my favorite Frederick Bachman, and you enjoyed this and want something very, very similar in terms of narrative structure, or you didn't like this because you wanted the narrator to be a little bit older, a little more mature, and you wanted maybe a little less whimsy or magic within the narrative, then I think this is a book you should probably consider picking up because the narrative structures, the ideas of these books are very similar. In My Grandmother Asked Me to Tell You She's Sorry, you have a young girl going on a scavenger hunt to find out more about a person in her life who's dying or died. The ideas, the concepts, the root of the narrative structures is very similar. Next up, I read Sharp Objects by Gillian Flynn, and this is a story of a woman who is a reporter in Chicago, I believe. This reporter goes back to her hometown because there have been child murders. Over the last few months, there's been 2 of them, and so she goes to investigate, figure out what's going on. I felt like this was unnecessarily dark and awkward and weird. The ending wasn't really like a shock. However, it was still horrifying, and I don't like how it was constructed. This is Gillian Flynn's first novel, so for a debut, I think it was decent enough, but wasn't my favorite. I've heard various people call various of Gillian Flynn's works their favorite, so I'm not giving up on her. I'm still going to read Dark Places, I think it's called. I'm also eagerly anticipating her next book because it is part of the Hogarth Shakespeare retelling collection, and she's doing the Hamlet retelling. I am eagerly anticipating that. I do plan on reading other things by her, but I just didn't like this book. I gave it a 2.5 stars. I am watching the HBO adaptation, and I am enjoying that, so I mean, it's not all bad. but I will never reread this. Next up, we have a book of poetry. This is The Mermaid Saves Herself in this one by Amanda Lovelace, which is the third and final book in her Women Are Some Sort of Magic trilogy, which is a trilogy of poetry collections. I've read all three, obviously, and this was actually my least favorite in the collection. However, I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars, and I don't know what I gave the other two. This probably, in all honesty, would be a 2.5 if it weren't for the collaborations Amanda put in the book. She put in collaborations from other poets, and I loved those so much that it really brought the poetry collection as a whole up to a new level for me. I just don't connect with a lot of modern poetry, so that's really the source of the problem here, but I always try and I always want to love it. There have been so many times where I have found a collection of modern poetry that I have enjoyed more than others, and so I'm always looking for those gems, and that's why I keep trying. But I am glad I read this also. Jenna from Jenna Claire K has a poem featured. She's one of the collaborators, so that's great. Her poem was wonderful. So last December, I believe, I read a short story by Casey West, and I really enjoyed it. I loved it so much that I decided I wanted to read more of Casey West's work, and so I tweeted out into the world of the Twitterverse and actually got a bunch of replies from a lot of you, but also a reply from Casey West, and she told me to start with The Distance Between Us, and I finally read it this month. And this was fun. This was about a girl who works at her family's owned antique doll store, which is a random niche, but you know, it's a thing. And basically business isn't booming. Things aren't going so hot for her, but she's almost out of there. She's almost graduated, so whatever. One day, the grandson of one of her regulars comes into the store. They become friends, a romance blooms. What do you expect from YA contemporary romance? I really enjoyed this. While I was reading it, I had so much fun. I enjoyed it immensely. However, upon reflection, it was super forgettable. Like, I honestly could not remember anything about the plot. I had to go to Goodreads, and as soon as I read like one sentence, I was like, oh yeah, I remember everything about this book, but like literally everything just like zapped out of my brain. So that's not a good sign. Also, there are some really weird moments in this book. There was a little girl shaming, which you probably know is one of my least favorite things ever in books. I didn't buy a lot of the things. However, I had so much fun while I was reading it. I ended up giving this a 3.5 stars. Maybe it deserves lower, but I had a lot of fun, like I said, reading it. So this is where we are. And I will be reading more Casey West. I read a book that I didn't think I'd ever read, ever, and that's Verity by Colleen Hoover. So I have a unique history with Colleen Hoover. I guess it's actually not very unique at all because a lot of people have this somewhat similar history with Colleen Hoover. Read a lot of her books, enjoyed them enough, thought they were so fun. They were the fastest of reads. I always considered Colleen Hoover to be the person to get me out of what was going to be or what ended up being a reading slump. And then I read Ugly Love, and I hated it, and I realized how problematic her works were, and upon reflection, so many of the books that I previously enjoyed, I realized were not good. And then, after I read Ugly Love, I said I would never read another Colleen Hoover book again. And I picked one up after I was recommended it by a close friend, and she told me it was not problematic at all, and it wasn't. And that book was It Ends With Us, which is actually her least problematic book in my opinion, and one of my favorite books ever. Definitely my favorite Colleen Hoover book. And so I was like, you know, this was a good run, but I don't think I'm going to read anything else by her. I think she's still going to be problematic. And then one day, one of my coworkers or ex-coworkers sent me a message at work saying, in all caps, Verity. And I was like, what? The book? I read this because of her. She told me to read it. So this book really starts out as Lowen, our protagonist, is down on her luck and is approached by a publisher about finishing Verity's very popular and successful series. Verity was in a car accident, is in a coma, and is unable to finish the book. Our main character is tasked with finishing the series, and it comes with a pretty paycheck. So she decides in the end to do it and moves into Verity's household in order to do some research, just get a feel for the story so she can finish it up, write it out. And while she's there, she starts a romance with Verity's husband. She finds a memoir that she shouldn't be reading. So every other chapter, every few chapters, we'll get a perspective from Lowen's chapter, her perspective, story moving forward, and then every few chapters we'll get a perspective of that memoir. And so you figure out what's going on. Turns out like more things are happening. Verity's maybe not who everyone thinks she is, blah, blah, blah. This isn't a strong thriller in my opinion. I think this reads like contemporary with a mystery subplot. It reads like a bad romance. It reads like a lot of things that Colleen Hoover does. I think because of the context of this, I think because of the things Lowen is reading about in that memoir, you're able as a reader or as Lowen to justify her actions. It still felt like a Colleen Hoover book. I wouldn't say this is as problematic as other things. However, you know, there's still a cheating subplot in this. The issue with this book for me is that it's marketed as a Colleen Hoover thriller and it doesn't feel like a thriller at all. I think if you read thrillers, I wouldn't expect this to be a thriller. However, the ending is one of my favorite endings I've ever read. And I can't really tell you why, and I can't really tell you what it does, but endings like this just really get me. I love them. So because of that, I gave this a 3.5 stars. Next up, I read Tales of Beedle the Bard by J.K. Rowling. I wanted to read this before J.K. Rowling ruined the Harry Potter fandom for me. And I hate to say this, but it might have been too late. I should have read this years and years and years ago when it first came out. So, surprise, big Harry Potter fan me has never actually read this. I've read Quidditch for the Ages, I've read Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. Hadn't read this. I liked Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them and Quidditch for the Ages more than I like this. Fantastic Beasts, which is just an encyclopedia that says, this is the creature, this is what they do, this is maybe what they look like. It's literally an encyclopedia of animals. It reads super boring, and I like that better than I like this. This is the short story, fairy tale, blah, blah, blahs that are set in Harry Potter world. Sounds like something I would love. Like, this just screams Reggie would love this. Have to say, the stories weren't great. They were super forgettable. I was skimming through them, trying to get through them, didn't really love them. I mean, I read everything, but it felt like I was skimming through them. I did enjoy Professor Dumbledore's notes, which are like behind every story. I did really, 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 really love Three Brothers, which I knew I would. That was why I kept reading this book for. I knew I wanted to get to the Three Brothers story, which is a story actually referenced in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. And I did really love that story. I love that story so much that if that story had been the only thing published, and it was just published on its own, it would have been a 5 out of 5 stars. However, there were other things in this that I just didn't care about and didn't enjoy and didn't want to read. And so this collection, this book, The Tales of Beedle the Bard, got 3.5 out of 5 stars. I just don't know where we missed the mark. I don't know if I was bored, if I was in the wrong mindset reading this, if J.K. Rowling really has killed the fandom for me, or if this is just really not that good. Next up, we have Hold Still by Nina LaCour. This is a book about a girl whose best friend commits suicide, and this deals with the ramifications of that, the aftermath, and, you know, coming to terms with that for our main character. And I thought this was very beautiful, very moving. It reads really slow, which is kind of a style of Nina LaCour I'm discovering. Her books are very introspective and deal with emotions. They're very much character studies, and I really love that, especially in YA. I don't feel that we get that too often. This was very thoughtful. I thought it was very tastefully done. I thought, like I said, a very introspective, slow, beautiful build to a kind of emotional story, and I really just enjoyed this. I just really enjoyed Nina LaCour's work, I think. I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. If you're looking for something that's sad, but maybe it won't make you cry a ton because it's a slow burn kind of sad, then I highly recommend Hold Still. Also, if you're not going to be triggered by suicide or anything like that, because obviously that's a huge plot point here. Now, finally, we're moving on to the 5-star reads for this wrap up. And so the first one I have for you is Pride of Baghdad by Brian K. Vaughan. This is the story of a pride of lions who live in the Baghdad Zoo. There is an American raid on the Baghdad Zoo and they are let out of the zoo. And so it's them trying to figure out how to survive. This deals with family dynamics and I found it very enjoyable and interesting. This is one of my favorite graphic novels of all time, and upon rereading it, actually, it's got some things that I just didn't remember in it, but I still really love this. I still really recommend this if you can handle it. I think the art style is one of the most beautiful things ever. I think the color palette is beautiful, and the story, I think it's really interesting. It's not like a lot of things I've read, and maybe that's why I like it so much. It really stands out to me. But next up, I read 3 Taylor Jenkins Reid books this month, and so actually ranking these was hard. So we're gonna start off with After I Do. I believe this was Taylor Jenkins Reid's sophomore book, and it follows a couple who decide to separate for a year. At the beginning of the story, we alternate back and forth between them falling in love in college and to this point where, you know, they're married and back to falling in love, back to married, and you're starting to kind of work your way towards this moment that like explodes upon them, that they decide that they need to take a trial separation and break. And so after that decision is made, the rest of the book follows that year apart and what happens during that year apart. It's very heartbreaking in a lot of ways. It's very beautiful in a lot of ways. It deals with exploration and love, obviously, and life within marriage, family ideals, trying to figure out what you want out of life, how you live with someone else. In a lot of ways, it was hard to read, but it was so beautiful. I loved it. 5 out of 5 stars. Now these next two, I feel like every time I want to talk about them, I switch. I go back and forth between which one's my favorite and which one's not, but I guess we're going to talk about Daisy Jones and the Six first. It follows their rise to the top of the charts and then their subsequent breakup as a band. This is very much a 70s book in terms of like there's sex, drugs, rock and roll, blah, blah, blah. But the crux of this story to me is the best love triangle to ever exist. Like ever. Like you think you don't like love triangles? Try this one. It's so beautiful. I think this book was so fun and I get the hype behind it. I never got the hype behind Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. Like I enjoyed it. I still gave it like a 4.5 or 5 out of 5 stars. I think though, now that I've read a lot of Taylor Jenkins Reid's work, Seven Husbands is actually my least favorite from her so far. And so I get the hype behind Daisy Jones though. It's so smart and so clever. And the thing that I like the most about it is you get to the end and there is a reveal. And I should have seen it coming, but I didn't. But that reveal changes everything you know about the story because other things have to be taken into a different perspective now. The reason some things maybe felt off in this way or in that way were because of this thing you don't know. And I just think the execution of that is so smart. It makes this a very rereadable book because once you know that, you kind of want to go back and consume it again, knowing what you know now. I think there are some beautiful characters in this book. My favorite is the underrated and beloved Karen. She is fantastic. She is a beautifully determined, wonderfully sassy, adorably feminist, fantastic character that I love with all of my heart. She is easily the best character I've read about in 2019. She's my favorite character I've read about in years, I think. I love her so much. She is my heart and soul. I related to her so much in her perspectives. Her and I are just on the same wavelength and I'm here for it. I love her. And I really did love this book. I get the hype. I think it's so smart. I think it's so fun. I haven't reread it, but I want to, and as everyone who has probably pitched this book to you, the audiobook is so good. Go check it out. We have a fantastic cast in this, including my favorite January Lavoie, but also a cast of amazing other narrators, and I highly recommend the audiobook. In the beginning, you might mix up a few characters or not feel like you grasp it 100%, but I promise you, if you stick with it, it'll be well worth it. I feel like I would have been more confused and disconnected if I had read it physically. I have one more book to talk about. If you are new around here, I rank my wrap-ups from my least favorite to my most favorite. So in talking about Daisy Jones and the Six first, I have thus declared officially that my favorite Taylor Jenkins Reid book is One True Loves. So this is a story of a woman who marries her high school sweetheart. On their 1-year wedding anniversary, her husband is off on like a freelance project for his job and the helicopter he's in goes down and he's presumed dead. Years and years pass. She's grieving. She eventually does fall in love again with another guy she knew in high school. And honestly, not long after they get engaged, and remember this has been years since the helicopter went down, she gets a call that her husband is actually alive. So he comes back and she has to make this decision about who she wants to be with. And it's a story about having more than one love of your life, how your life can change, how people can grow apart, whether you are with or without a person, how different lives can come together, how people can change, how situations can change, how life can change, how what you want out of life can change. It does deal heavily with like you can be in love with multiple people at the same time, but also you can have more than one love of your life. And that's kind of what our character in this is trying to discover is like, what do I do in this situation? It's beautifully told. I think it's exquisite. There were so many lines in this that like really just like melted my heart, struck a chord with me. I thought this was beautiful. Love this book so much with all of my heart and soul. Favorite Taylor Jenkins read book. Oh, I mentioned when I was talking about Daisy Jones that that was like one of the best love triangles of all time. This is also one of the best love triangles of all time. Obviously, you have a main character who's torn by a past current love and a current future love. Complicated. But she's torn between her husband and her fiance, and that is its own very unique and special kind of love triangle. I think it's done so well, and I think what's done so well about it is that it's such unique circumstance that you don't deal with. I thought it was very well done, very tastefully approached, beautifully executed. Highly recommend it if you're a fan of TJR. So those are all of the books I read and DNF'd in the month of July. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't already. Comment down below. Let me know if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them. Also, let me know what you think about this filming angle. I really like it. I hope you like this angle because I feel like I'm gonna film here a lot more in the future. Anyways, we're gonna stop rambling. We're gonna end this video. I will see you in my next one. Bye!